I'm Emily Mashak, and you are listening to the first episode in an upcoming series for Tuned Into NoCo. We'll be exploring the various cold cases in Larimer and Weld counties. Today, I spoke with Barbara Fleming, a historian and writer here in Fort Collins, to talk about the oldest cold case in Larimer County, the unsolved murder of Joseph Allen. So thank you for joining me today, Barbara.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we get into the cold case, I just want to talk a little bit about you. You've done a lot of things here in Fort Collins.
Yes, I have.
Yes, it's going to be hard, but can you just give me a brief little history of your life? Who is Barbara?
I'm a native of Fort Collins. I was born here at Larimer County Hospital, which is no longer here. I grew up in Fort Collins. I went to Fort Collins High School and Colorado State University, and I spent my working life partly as a journalist and partly as a teacher. After I retired, I started writing more, and in the last 20 years, since I retired in 2000, I have written or co-written 6 books of local history, 3 historical novels, and a weekly column for the Fort Collins, Colorado.
Very cool. That is quite the accomplishment. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the books you've written? What are they called?
The first one we did is, I did it with Mac McNeil, is called Images of Fort Collins Mark Miller Photographs, and it's a retrospective of Mark's photographs over several decades, from 1914 to 1970. We went through over 70,000 of his photographs to select the ones that are in the book.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work.
I have a picture taken by Mark Miller in my bedroom of my mother in her wedding dress, and he took several of our school pictures too.
Oh, I bet she looks beautiful in that dress.
She did, yes.
That's awesome. I was also reading on your website about your advice that you had for young writers.
Yes.
Would you be able to share some of that here?
What I have found in writing is that everybody writes differently, but the thing to do if you're an aspiring writer is to keep writing and not worry about whether it's correct, whether it's what you want to say. The point is to get it down on paper or in the computer these days, and then you can shape it, you can do what you want with it, but you have to have a body of work first. And the way I write is not necessarily the way other people write. When I write fiction, my characters sort of take over and I just record what they do. But writing for my column, doing other kinds of writing, I do extensive research. And if anybody is planning to do historical writing, I think research is primary.
Mm-hmm. Going into that a little bit, how did you become so interested and knowledgeable about Fort Collins history?
I have always been interested in history. When I was a child, the library was in the Carnegie Building on Matthew Street. And behind the library, east of it, was the Pioneer Museum. And I used to go in there after I went to the library and spend hours in the museum just prowling around. When I went to college, this was in the 1950s, I wanted to teach history, and I was told, women don't do that, you will never get a job. So I set aside my interest in history and taught English for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have time to write.
Yeah, but you eventually clearly got into writing history.
I did.
Very nice. Now, we're here to talk about the unsolved case of Officer Joseph Allen, who was murdered in 1907. What happened?
Joseph Allen came to Colorado apparently in 1906 on his own on a bicycle. He left behind a wife and family in Parsons, Kansas, and eventually he ended up in Fort Collins working for the police department. We can only surmise that they didn't have the same standards for hiring officers that they do now. But he had been working for the police for about 2 months when he was patrolling in what they called the jungles. The jungles was the area around the sugar beet factory off what is now LeMay near Vine. And it was an area with bars and dance halls and brothels. Fort Collins was dry at the time, so you could go outside the city limits. One place to go was the jungles. Consequently, there were bootleggers there, and there was opportunity to buy liquor. And people who went there tended not to be the most upright sort, shall we say. So Alan, who was at the time only 45 years old, was patrolling on the night of July 3rd, 1907. Remember, it would be dark there. Didn't have street lights in those days. But he apparently felt quite confident. He was seen stopping and talking to some people. And then around 11 at night, he was heard moaning, and he was found unconscious by a bush, taken to a hospital. We did not have a public hospital at that time, and he died 3 hours later. He had been struck on the head with a brick. His skull was crushed. He had also been robbed of his nightstick and his revolver. They were never found. The brick was found. A coroner's jury was convened, impaneled, and they determined that 3 men, Roy Kelly, the one who claimed to have found Alan unconscious, Harry Hill, and James Klaus were guilty of murder. This was on very circumstantial evidence. A brick and proximity were absolutely all the evidence they had. But the coroner's jury found that Alan had been murdered and that Kelly, Hill, and Klaus had committed the crime. This was the first time in 20 years that a grand jury was impaneled, and it was subsequently impaneled, and I need to note that it was an all-male jury. Women were not permitted on juries until several decades later. So this was an all-male jury who then indicted these 3 men for murder, again, on the circumstantial evidence. They were all in the area at the time. They had been seen. 2 were known bootleggers, and 1 was a known miscreant, and the bloody brick was found. Now, Alan's sister, Mrs. W.J. Richmond, and again, I need to note that women in those days were very seldom described in print with their given names. So the only name we have for her is Mrs. W.J. Richmond, but she was Alan's sister. And when she came to Fort Collins, she explained that her dear brother, who never drank, never did anything wrong, had just one fault, and that was that he couldn't seem to support his family. After he came to Colorado, he had begged his wife to come, and she refused to come because she was afraid he would not be able to support her. He had apparently flitted from job to job. But Mrs. Richmond said he was a good man, and he did not deserve to die that way. Now, here is where it gets curious. There is no report of an actual trial taking place. All of this disappears from the media shortly after the grand jury was impaneled. And apparently the charges on the 3 men were dropped for lack of evidence. We don't know what happened to these men. They just disappeared from public view. But one of them, whose name was Thomas Harbour, had been seen in the area and had been questioned in 1907, and then he disappeared. But in 1914, this is 7 years later, he came into City Hall where the police were housed. It was all housed on Walnut Street at the time. City Hall, fire station, police station. Pretty much where old Firehouse Books is now.
Mm-hmm.
And so he came in because he had misplaced his wife. They had been camping up the Poudre, he said, and she had gone to town and didn't come back, and she was missing. But the police said, aha, you are a suspect in our cold case murder, and lo and behold, they arrested him. Again, on circumstantial evidence, and the only thing they had to go by in this case was that he had been seen in the vicinity at the time of the crime.
Wow.
So, once again, it all disappears from the media. He was apparently released for lack of evidence, and the murder of Joseph Allen has become the longest-standing cold case in Fort Collins Police Department history. It is still an open case.
Wow.
Now, generally when solving a murder, they speak of means, opportunity, and motive. Well, certainly they discovered the means. They found the brick. The opportunity was there, a dark night, no one around to rescue him. But motive is the curious thing. He'd only been with the police 2 months. How could there have been anyone who'd been arrested and released and wanting to kill him? And besides, he was well-known and well-liked. And if it was a case of robbery, why not confront him and just take what they wanted instead of bashing him from behind, which is what happened. So you can have means, you can have opportunity, but they never came up with a believable motive. And that's the curious story of poor Joseph Allen.
Wow. Have there been any updates at all that you've learned about since that time in 1914?
Nothing. No, in fact, I heard a man who wrote a book, a history of the Fort Collins Police Department, speak at a meeting, and he said, it's still an open case, but it will probably never be solved. There's nobody around to deal with it. What we have to surmise is that in those days they did not have the forensic abilities that we have now. They couldn't possibly have found the kinds of evidence that police can find nowadays through technology, because they simply didn't have it. Fingerprinting had become fairly common, but there was no database against which to compare it. So how useful is that?
Yeah. Now, kind of like you mentioned, 1907 is a long time ago. Do you think there's any possibility that someone out there still knows something?
Oh, no. Anyone who would have been alive at the time would be long gone by now. And if stories had been passed down through generations, stories tend to get distorted as they are told and retold. So, no, I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about this case. It's so interesting to hear it in such detail, especially so many years later. Kind of going along with that, we talked a little bit about your writing advice earlier. What is your advice for going about cases like these and finding this information? consolidating it into one piece?
I relied almost entirely on the local history archive housed in the Museum of Discovery. The people who work there are magicians. They can come up with almost anything. And Leslie Strook, who is the archivist, dug up some of this information for me. There is also a historic newspaper collection online, which goes from about 1860-something to 1923. And we plowed through that. This is what we came up with.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for coming in and talking to me about this today. It was really cool to hear your perspective. I appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome.
And that is the story of the oldest cold case in Fort Collins, the unsolved murder of Joseph Allen in 1907. Special thanks to historian and writer Barbara Fleming for coming in to tell the story today. If you would like to find more of her work, you can visit her website at authorbarbarafleming.com.